Welcome to the Molecules and Minerals podcast. I'm Stephen Goldman. I'm a former trial lawyer, corporate director, executive, and a biotech investor. I'm here today with Arun Swaminathan, Ph.D. He's the CEO of Coya Therapeutics, Inc. Coya is a Houston-based clinical stage biotech company focused on developing biologics that enhance the function of regulatory T cells, also known as Tregs, in neurodegenerative diseases, and developing potentially transformational therapies for patients suffering from devastating neurodegenerative diseases, including Amyotrophic Lateral Sclerosis, or ALS, also commonly called Lou Gehrig's disease, Frontotemporal Dementia, or FTD, and potentially Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. Last year, the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine was awarded to Coya's Scientific Advisory Board member, Dr. Shimon Sakaguchi, who discovered Tregs, and for his pioneering work in elucidating Treg biology. In a number of small investigator-initiated clinical trials, promising clinical results, including clinically meaningful stabilization and potentially alteration of disease progression, were shown in treating both ALS and FTD using a combination of low-dose interleukin-2, also known as IL-2, and CTLA-4 Ig, and that's a proprietary combination given in the form of a subcutaneous injection of Coya's leading investigational drug named Coya 302, and which Arun will discuss in more detail. So in December, Coya began dosing ALS patients in a phase 2 double-blind placebo-controlled trial in both the US and Canada called All-Stars, testing Coya 302 in 120 ALS patients who are randomly divided into 2 treatment groups and 1 placebo group. And that trial will be for an initial period of 24 weeks with a follow-up extension trial for an additional 24 weeks. The placebo group of patients will all be treated with Coya 302 during the 24-week extension. So if all goes well, the All-Stars trial will be fully enrolled later this year with an anticipated top-line readout in the first half of 27. And for those unfamiliar with the disease, ALS is a progressive, fatal neurodegenerative disease which causes muscle to waste away. There's no cure, although some treatments can help manage symptoms. There's a very large unmet medical need in ALS that Coya hopes it can help to meet. As well, in January, Coya received IND approval by the FDA to begin a phase 2 trial testing Coya 302 for the treatment of frontotemporal dementia, FTD, and that phase 2 trial in FTD is expected to begin later this year. For those unfamiliar with FTD, it is the most common form of dementia in people under the age of 65, affecting approximately 60,000 Americans. It's characterized by loss of intellectual function, and is manifested by behavioral changes, loss of empathy, apathy, and executive function. FTD constitutes another high unmet medical need, as there is no treatment to stop or ameliorate the progression of the disease. Coya has a major strategic partnership with Dr. Reddy's Laboratories, which will also be discussed in more detail. Coya is listed on the Nasdaq exchange, symbol COYA, and has a market cap of just over $100 million. So, Arun, can you tell us about your background and how you ended up as CEO of Coya Therapeutics?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I really appreciate being on your show, so thank you for that. My background, I have 25, 30 years of experience in this industry. All of my background is pharmaceutical, biotech, all the way starting from my undergraduate degree in pharmacy. So I'm a pharmacist by training, followed by a Ph.D. in clinical pharmacology. My career really has kind of 3 big stages. The stage number 1 was I was in the R&D clinical organization at Bristol Myers Squibb as my first part of my career, where I learned what it takes from an R&D and scientific perspective to advance a molecule from discovery to an IND, NDA, BLA. So that's kind of step 1. The second part of my career was on the commercial side of things, again, at Bristol Myers Squibb for the most part, running marketing, commercial strategy, and getting experience on business development and the business side of how, now that you've gotten a product to the market, how do you make the product available to patients? How do you actually make this a real drug that is helping patients and also bringing revenue to the company? And then the last decade or 11 years or so of my career has been in what I would call the entrepreneurial intersection, including co-founding a company about 11 years ago and being the chief business officer of multiple public companies similar to Coya, where I've created value, where my key role was to create value and bring in funding into these companies successfully, both of which I was able to do. And that has all kind of led me to where I am today at Coya. So I joined Coya as Chief Business Officer about exactly 3 years ago and assumed the role of CEO about a year and a half ago. And what attracted me to Coya was the science, the approach we were taking, and the high unmet need in these patients. So I felt like the combination of the three really was something I wanted to be part of. I wanted to be part of this journey where we could potentially bring transformative therapies to patients that today don't have many options.
Okay, fantastic. So my next question is in two parts. So firstly, I want to talk about the science. So what are regulatory T cells, also known as Tregs, and what is the science behind your lead drug, Coya 302?
Regulatory T cells, as the name implies, they regulate something. And in this case, they regulate the T cells. The T cells are a key immune cell in our system that is beneficial when it is attacking a disease, attacking a foreign invader that it wants to keep in check. But it can be counterproductive when these T cells start attacking healthy cells, which is what happens in neurodegenerative diseases. The T cells are attacking the nerve cells. The nerve cells then stop communicating, which leads to the progression of these diseases. So the regulatory T cells are kind of the safety guards, security guards, brakes, which our analogy works for people, that keep this immune system in balance, keeps it in check, not from getting too crazy one way or the other. And that is what we target. We target keeping these regulatory T cells functional. So that is a key function of the regulatory T cells, is to maintain an immune balance.
And so how does Coya 302 work? I understand it's a combination of a low-dose interleukin-2 and CTLA-4 Ig.
Yeah, it is a combination of two agents, and the combination is a key differentiator of how we use this scientific approach of restoring Treg dysfunction. Tregs are neuroprotective by definition, and in diseases like ALS, you see a very high degree of Treg dysfunction. So what the low-dose interleukin-2 component does is it expands these regulatory T cells. So simply put, it increases the number and function of these regulatory T cells. But the scientific challenge to date, Stephen, has been that when you fix the function of these Tregs, when you fix these brakes, but you put them back in an inflammatory environment, which is what patients with ALS FTD are in, the macro environment is inflammatory, these Tregs become dysfunctional pretty fast. And then you kind of defeat the purpose. And that is the second component of our drug, CTLA-4 Ig. It acts on a different aspect of the immune system, on the CD80-86 pathway. And what it does in a simplistic manner is these activated myeloid cells or macrophages that are now producing pro-inflammatory chemokines and cytokines, which create this inflammatory milieu, the CTLA-4 tamps that down through a different immunological pathway. So we're now able to keep the environment less inflammatory or anti-inflammatory. now the Tregs that have become functional stay functional for a long and sustained period of time, which then translates to meaningful clinical efficacy.
That's the theory. And then I understand you had four small investigator-initiated clinical trials testing this combination, which is your Coya 302, in both ALS and FTD. And I understand you had some very encouraging results, and perhaps you could discuss that, because I take it that was the basis upon which you decided to proceed to phase 2 trials.
Exactly. I mean, we have had multiple investigator-initiated trials studying this combination, low-dose IL-2 plus CTLA-4 Ig, in both ALS and frontotemporal dementia. In ALS, in a very small study, what we saw was, number one, the Treg numbers and functions were improved. So that's something we expected, shows that the mechanism is doing what we anticipate it will do. Two, we saw changes in biomarkers in a favorable direction. So oxidative stress markers came down. So now we know that not only are we doing what we're supposed to do mechanistically, that mechanism is translating to biomarkers that predict that inflammation is coming down. And three, the most meaningful outcome from a patient perspective is we saw that these patients did not progress in their ALS disease. So that on an average, we stopped the progression of ALS at 6 months, and there was a very minimal decline at 1 year time point in these patients as well. And when we compared this to what would typically happen, it was pretty remarkable. We can go into the details of what happens typically to an ALS patient, but that was remarkable. So we see those three things happen in ALS. And we see that repeat itself in a study that was done, again, a very small number of patients in frontotemporal dementia. Everything I just said for ALS, same thing. Treg function numbers go up, biomarkers move in the right direction. And in sort of ALS FRS score, which is the ALS endpoint, in FTD, cognition was also stabilized as measured by CDR-FTLD and the Montreal Assessment Scale, both basically cognitive function tests. So that's the remarkable part, and that's what gave us confidence that moving forward with our phase 2 study, first in ALS, that there's a high degree, we feel, of probability of success given the strong science and the data to date. Of course, that is exactly what we are testing, that hypothesis, and we'll have that answer, as you mentioned in the introduction, in the first quarter of 2027.
Let's talk about your All-Stars trial. That's your phase 2 double-blind placebo-controlled trial for Coya 302 in ALS. I read I think it was your December 9th, 2025 press release, and talked about that you had already dosed your first patients. But why don't you tell our listeners about the All-Stars trial design, kind of the patient eligibility, because it looks like you're trying to enroll mild to moderate ALS patients, and what your endpoints are going to be.
The All-Stars trial is a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial. Now, when we say placebo, what we really mean is patients are going to be on whatever standard of care they currently are on for ALS. 2 dose groups of Coya 302 will be studied against placebo. So there's a 66% chance that a patient in this trial will actually receive a treatment. The 2 doses, what differs in them is not the dose, it's the frequency. We're testing a every 2-week regimen, and we're testing a every 1-month regimen. The every 2-week regimen is where we generated the data in the IIT study in ALS, and the monthly was where we generated data in frontotemporal dementia. So we have strong reasons to believe both those regimens are going to work. Of course, if the 1 month works, there's obvious commercial advantages to a once-a-month regimen versus every 2-week regimen. So we're studying both. The endpoint is ALS-FRS, which is a measure of how well or how poorly a patient is doing. And that is the FDA-accepted endpoint. So that'll be our primary endpoint. We'll be looking for that endpoint at 6 months, but also as we continue the trial. But at 6 months will be kind of our regulatory endpoint, if I may, where we're going to look to see if at 6 months there is a statistical and clinically meaningful difference between the placebo group and the treatment groups. The study will continue after 6 months, where the patients who are on the placebo arm will now be re-randomized to one of the treatment arms and will continue for 48 weeks, essentially. So at the end of 6 months, every patient on the trial will be on a treatment arm. And what is nice and unique about that design is that it'll give us some insight, in addition to the 6 months, what happens with patients that have progressed in disease and are now being put on therapy, because that's what's going to happen to patients on placebo, and how do they respond? Which then gets to your question of what kinds of patients are we including? And we're including patients who have a score of 35 or above on this scale called ALS-FRS. 48 is the highest score, which means there is no ALS. 35 is in that mild to moderate ALS range. Or from a practical perspective, these patients still have a lot of their motor functions. They're still able to function in a lot of aspects of their life. So that is kind of where we want them, because then we can actually make a meaningful difference in these patients by stopping the progression at that point. So, and also it reduces the variability of patients coming at a later stage who are already on a ventilator, etc. So that's one of the criterias. We also have an additional criteria that the patients coming into this trial are declining at what is a typical rate for ALS patients and are not outliers. So we will be excluding patients who are declining rapidly, which is a small percentage of patients. And there's a small percentage of patients that tend to decline really slow as well. So those two patients will be excluded. So in addition to that, we're stratifying patients by something called a neurofilament light. Those familiar with ALS know NFL well. It is an FDA-accepted biomarker as a surrogate for efficacy in ALS. We'll be screening patients for ALS and stratifying them so the distribution is even between low, medium, and high NFL levels across the groups. This is important because this is something unique to the Coya trial. I do not believe anybody else has stratified patients this way in ALS. What it does is it makes sure that across the groups, more or less, the inflammatory state coming in is evenly distributed. So that's an important element of our design that reduces variability. And of course, NFL is also our secondary endpoint. ALS-FRS is primary, NFL is the secondary. We have a few other criteria like breathing capacity, etc. But Stephen, these are some of the key criteria of the design of the study.
Maybe you could give us just a little bit more color on the progression that these patients I'm talking about ALS. I understand from the study, you're looking at patients that their progression rate is 0.5 to 1.5. And is the average about 1.0? Is that how it per month?
Precisely.
Oh, I see.
Average based on this database called PRO-ACT, which is thousands of patients coming out of Harvard and Mass General, shows that the average ALS patient declines about 1 point a month. So that's 6 points in 6 months. And that's our primary endpoint, is at 6 months. So the average placebo patient, if they follow the pattern, would have declined 6 points. So if they came in at 35, they're going to be around 29, right? That's kind of the mathematical assumption. And if we start on treatment at 35 and stay at 35, that's obviously going to be dramatically meaningful. Or if our patients went down to 33, that is still going to be clinically and statistically meaningful. The study is powered to show a 3-point difference in the score at 6 months. But to your question, what does the score really mean? 6 points at 6 months means 12 points at 12 months. What does it all mean? What it means is, as an example, if a patient today has a slight motor dysfunction in one of their arms, and that is really all they're having difficulty with. 6 points can be the difference between that and being on a wheelchair. 12 points can be the difference between that and being on a ventilator. So every single point is a dramatic quality of life impact on the patient. So every month, every day, every minute we slow down that progression is going to eventually meaningfully translate to an increased survival in these patients. And more importantly, more than just increasing survival, it should also allow them to survive with an improved or stabilized quality of life. And that is what we're trying to achieve. Is can we keep a patient from not getting worse than they were when they came in, and kind of in an ideal vision, dream would be that the patient then could stay at that state forever. At this point, our science doesn't say we can reverse the damage that has already been done. So what we're hoping for is we can stop the damage from getting worse. And we've seen evidence of that, with the caveat that they were really small investigator-initiated trials, but that's exactly the evidence we have seen to date.
Well, that's potentially very exciting. And your FTD trial, and obviously your IND cleared. So when do you expect to start the trial, and are you able to share what that trial might look like?
Yeah, we expect to start the trial later this year. The trial is still being, this fine-tuned. We're working with top opinion leaders, but of course we already have FDA feedback on our protocol, so it's not going to deviate too much from that. The trial is going to, again, be a double-blind study, about 40 to 50 patients. So we're doing some of the statistical work to determine the exact number of patients at this point. But they'll be randomized to either the Coya 302 treatment or a placebo arm again, with 6 months being the initial readout, and then they'll continue on to 1 year. Very similar in that sense to the ALS design. We are going to be in this trial including a subgroup of FTD patients called non-fluent aphasia primary progressive patients. FTD has a lot of different ways it manifests. Some people have a stronger behavioral component, and some people have less. It's more speech related, and that's where we're going to focus first, less on the behavioral subtype, simply because the behavioral subtype patients introduce a lot of variability. So we first want to understand in a smaller trial how we work before we expand it to the broader FTD population. And behavioral FTD, as the name suggests, results in sometimes pretty dramatic changes in behavior in these patients, which makes them non-compliant with therapies and participation in trials. So there's so we're keeping it focused initially on the non-fluent aphasia progressive subtype. So.
That's terrific. And when do you think investors may get an update on your trial and when the trial might begin?
I think we will be able to provide an update as we get closer to having worked with all our sites and opinion leaders and picked our sites where we're going to do the trials. I think that'll be the right time. So I would imagine that's going to happen more towards the early second half of 2026.
Terrific. So let's talk about the size of the markets for ALS and FTD. How large a market is it for Coya 302 in these two indications?
Yeah, there are significant market opportunities, upwards of multi-billion globally. Just in the United States, these are multi-billion indications. ALS, there are 6,000 new patients diagnosed in the U.S. every year. There's about 30 to 35,000 patients on any given day. The number kind of unfortunately stays steady today because of the lifespan of ALS patients, which is on an average 3 to 5 years. Hopefully, Coya and other companies working on ALS therapies will change that in the future. That's our goal, and ironically increase that number, because then that means ALS patients are surviving. So the last product that launched in ALS and has subsequently been taken off the market did quite well in the first year. So we have a real example of the market opportunity. They did about $500 million in the first year before they were withdrawn from the market. So ALS can easily reach 1 billion plus in the United States alone. This doesn't include Canada. This doesn't include Europe. When you start adding Europe and Japan, you're looking at a 3 billion plus opportunity. Europe has more or less the same dollar value. They have more patients, but as you probably know, Europe will have a lower pricing, but it kind of, from a dollar perspective, will be pretty equal to the US market. Japan is another significant ALS market. Depending on how you look at Japan, it's the third largest country in terms of ALS incidence, or second largest country if you kind of look at Europe by country basis, where Germany and Japan are pretty close to each other. So the market's pretty big. On FTD, there isn't really an approved therapy, so there is no benchmark. But again, the prevalence rates are higher than ALS, but there's more subtypes in FTD. But even if you account for the subtypes and discount that some patients may not be eligible for any therapy, you're still looking at a size similar to ALS. So again, from a pricing perspective, these two products will have the same. They have high unmet need. So the payer reimbursement landscape is pretty good. And we've seen that with the last product that launched, that they got pretty well reimbursed, both in the United States and Canada, which were the two markets they had launched in as well. And so I think, the commercial potential for an indication like this is pretty good. And the unmet need is so high that products that are approved in this space are likely to have a pretty rapid uptake compared to traditional therapies.
So interleukin-2, your IL-2 component of Coya 302, is well known, particularly in the oncology space, where it's used in much higher doses. And as you and I talked about last time we spoke, it can be toxic at higher doses. But you're using a very low dose, and I understand it's like 1/50th or 2% of what I'll call the full dose that was normally seen in oncology. So what is the safety and tolerability profile of your low dose IL-2?
Yeah, I think you basically said it. We're using 1/50th of the IL-2 dose that's typically used in an oncology setting. So we don't anticipate any significant safety concerns. I mean, scientifically, one wouldn't expect it. And that's why we do the trials. And if there is something, we'll see it in the trials. But so far, all we have seen is localized injection site reactions, which is typical of drugs that are given sub-Q. And given that low a dose, we don't expect really anything atypical or unusual that happens in these patients. Our second component, CTLA-4, also has been well studied in indications like rheumatoid arthritis, and more recently in psoriatic arthritis and graft versus host as well. But mainly, the millions of patients have received this drug in the RA space. I was part of the launch team at Bristol Myers Squibb that launched Orencia, the CTLA-4 Ig. So I'm very familiar with that product, and it has a great safety profile in itself. And it's been on the market for almost 15 years now, pretty safely. And again, we're using, in ALS at least right now, half the dose as well. So we're using lower doses. Scientifically, there's no rationale to believe we're going to see any quirky safety signals coming from this study.
Okay. So I understand from a safety point of view, the advantage of low dose IL-2 and CTLA-4 Ig. But I also understand with the method of injection, the subcutaneous injection, that can be self-administered.
Yeah, it's like the GLP-1 injections that people are now familiar with, right under the skin, subcutaneous. Self-administered, of course, in the case of patients who are ALS or FTD patients, they may need a caregiver to do that, depending on their status of the disease. But it can be done at the home setting. That's the key. Keep it in the fridge, take it out, give it just like a GLP-1 injection.
So that has to be a major advantage over other forms of treatment that may require an IV, etc. All right, so let's now talk about your strategic partner, Reddy's Laboratories. this is a major, as far as I understand, this is a major strategic partnership, but only in relation to ALS. And perhaps you could talk about the details, the financial and other details of this partnership.
Yeah, we have a strategic partner in Dr. Reddy's who we are thrilled to have as our partner. They have been a truly value-creating partner for us. The partnership that we entered into late in 2023 with them gives them the rights to commercialize Coya 302 for one indication only, and that is ALS, across major geographies. The easiest way is to say what is excluded, excluding Japan, South America, and Mexico. So excluding those regions, Dr. Reddy's has the rights to the other geographies for this one indication. In exchange for that, we have already received 20 million or so in upfront plus milestone payments from Dr. Reddy's. We continue to be eligible for additional milestones as we progress through the regulatory milestones, approvals, etc. And then once a product is commercialized, we are eligible for mid-teen royalties and up to 650 million in sales milestone. So it puts Coya in a nice place for $100 million company, as you said in the introduction, where we have line of sight to non-dilutive cash on a kind of steady basis, which is unique to a company this size. Potentially, assuming we launch and can launch, we could be cash flow positive in the not so distant future. So that's again something that's very unique for a small biotech company, assuming, of course, that the ALS trial goes well, we get approval on one trial with all those caveats. We do have the path to cash flow positive in a 2 to 3 year time span, which not too many companies can say. So that's what this basic structure of the relationship. But the intangibles of that relationship are worth a lot more than the dollar numbers I just gave you, right? Because we get technical expertise, we get manufacturing expertise, regulatory expertise, and just the resources of Dr. Reddy's that gets kind of available to Coya through this partnership that, it's hard for me to describe that value, and it's wonderful for us. And then in addition to that, so that is just the licensing agreement. That is a non-equity agreement. So there was no equity exchanged in return for that agreement. More recently, about a month or 40 days ago, Dr. Reddy's also took an equity position in our company. They invested $10 million, which puts them right under the 10% of the company's ownership in late January. So that's an investment. So they're also now an investor in the company.
Fantastic. So you mentioned a little while ago about the size of the Japanese market. You were saying they're perhaps the third largest potential market for ALS. And of course, you have a carve out for Coya 302 in ALS in Japan. And I noted in your, you wrote a letter to shareholders on January 20th, in which you actually said that Coya was planning to have discussions for potential partners for the Japanese market for Coya 302 in ALS. So a follow-up on that January 20th letter, how's that going?
Well, I mean, we obviously continue to have those conversations. Being a public company, I can't really say more than that, except that it is my job. It is our job to have those conversations. We do believe there's a lot of untapped value in the Japan market, but we want to do it at the right time. We want to do it at the right value, and we want to do it with the right partner. So we do think that there's a huge upside opportunity for us in a partnership with Japan. The timing when, it's hard for me to guide to those at this point in time.
Of course, and if you have a successful phase 2 trial, that it's much more valuable.
Yeah.
So other than ALS and FTD, what other indications could Coya 302 be used for?
The nice thing about Coya 302 and our mechanism is that it can translate to many diseases like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, because what all these diseases share in common is they are neuroinflammatory diseases. And neuroinflammation is what causes these diseases to progress. Now, ALS and FTD, I'm using a very simplistic analogy, but ALS and FTD are like forest fires. They are raging and they spread fast. Alzheimer's and Parkinson's are more like burning embers of coal, equally inflammatory, but they spread a little bit slower, but equally destructive at the end, right? That's why Alzheimer's disease patients, the progression is not as fast as an ALS or FTD patient. Same thing with Parkinson's. A lot of patients, takes them even up to 10 years before their symptoms are fully starting to progress, etc. But the underlying driver of progression is the neuroinflammation and Treg dysfunction. So we believe that 302 has potential in these diseases. Coya has not prioritized them simply because, Steve, as you know, these are expensive disease indications for a small company like Coya to pursue. So we want to stay focused on ALS and FTD where we can handle it on our own. And we'll be looking for the right partners, either with Coya 302 or I'm happy to talk about Coya 303, where we think there is an opportunity in Alzheimer's disease, especially to partner with the right company and move that program appropriately. Also, simultaneously in diseases like Alzheimer's, we will be looking for non-dilutive funding from agencies like the NIH and other non-dilutive foundations. Obviously, if we can get any of those, we will move those programs forward as well. But what we do not plan to do today is to move forward in those programs on our own without the right financing support from a strategic partner or a non-dilutive source.
Makes a lot of sense. So while there's no guarantees, if everything went well and you were successful with Coya 302 in ALS, and we'll know hopefully in the first part of 2027, there's a path forward for accelerated approval. When would it be possible, or how does that work in the accelerated approval pathway towards ultimate approval by the FDA? What would that look like?
The short answer is it's going to be data-driven. So we have to wait till we see the top line from the study because FDA or any regulatory agency can't really tell us whether there's a path for accelerated or breakthrough without actually seeing if the product worked. So that's going to be the first step. So asking any regulatory agency today if they can tell us if it's going to be sufficient, their answer is going to be, let me see the data, which is the appropriate answer. That's the answer I would give. So assuming the data is good, which we, based on the science, based on the data to date, believe it will be, then I think we have a really strong case to get approval on one trial because of the high unmet need here. The regulatory agencies will look at this trial with the context of the unmet need and in the context of some of the communications from the heads at FDA, like McCary, who published articles in New England Journal about one clinical trial. If there is diseases that fit that mold well, diseases like ALS obviously fit it well. FDA has precedence of approving the previous product on one clinical trial. They did do another one and were subsequently withdrawn. But yeah, I mean, FDA can take a lot of different paths, right? One is the data supports it. Yes, get us on the market. 2, get us on the market, but request another trial in parallel. 3, if the data doesn't support it, they could also say, hey, you may have to do another trial. We feel based on everything we've seen, we're going to be more in the scenario 1 or 2, less likely in the scenario 3, but only data can confirm that for us.
Right, of course, of course. I was only assuming best case scenario. Obviously, it's going to be data driven. So, and we've only had data from very small numbers so far, so it's still uncertain.
Yeah, but I think the key is what we're seeing is promising, and definitely tells us that the probability of technical success is good, and I think that's the best we can do at this point. So.
All right. So let's talk about your capital structure. You've got a market cap of just over $100 million. You have no debt, as far as I could see, other than your normal payables. And your cash position, I know you entered 2026 with about $46.8 million in cash. and you just got another $11.1 million January 30th. At least that was your announcement, including the 10 million from Dr. Reddy's, and the other 1.1 million, I guess, from your other largest shareholder. That's David Einhorn's company, Greenlight Capital, if I recall. Is that
Correct.
right? Are there any other major shareholders?
Yes, we have AIGH is publicly disclosed. I believe they have close to a 5 to 6% position. There are several others that in the last report you'll see publicly have disclosed their positions that include several healthcare focused funds, all of them under 5%. So the greater than 5% are AIGH, Greenlight, Dr. Reddy's, and then the management team collectively has, if I'm right, 7 or 8%
Okay,
ownership as well. So
terrific. And your cash position, is that sufficient to take you into the first half of 28?
we are currently guiding that it's sufficient to take us into the second half of 2027.
Okay.
But that includes getting past the top line ALS in the first quarter, initiating our FTD trial, and all that stuff.
Terrific. So your upcoming catalysts clearly are your phase 2 All-Stars trials and your FTD coming online for their phase 2 trial. And just briefly, I know you've got other pipelines. We've only discussed your most advanced, what I think is your most valuable lead drug, Coya 302, but you also have Coya 303, I guess, in Alzheimer's. And do you want to just briefly talk about that?
Yes. So it's a similar logic to Coya 302. It's a combination with the low-dose interleukin 2. The difference is instead of CTLA-4, we are now combining it with the GLP-1 agonists, these weight loss drugs that are popular. Not from an obesity perspective, but from a decreasing neuroinflammation perspective. What we've seen in preclinical models, both in vitro human cell line model as well as a neuroinflammatory rodent model, what we've seen is that the combination of the two tamps down key neuroinflammatory markers better than the single components. So there's synergy in that combination. What we have also seen is that GLP-1s alone, while they did not decrease the progression of dementia, in the large trials that Novo Nordisk did, there was positive movement in some of the key biomarkers in these trials known as EVOKE and EVOKE Plus. That gives us a lot of hope because what we are seeing in the preclinical model is exactly that. The individual components alone don't do enough on the biomarkers, but the combination seems to suppress these biomarkers to the kind of percentages that generally translate to be clinically meaningful. We only have preclinical data, so obviously a next step to demonstrate that this combination can make a difference in patients with Alzheimer's is to do a clinical study. That's where we see a lot of opportunity for Coya to perhaps enter into business development partnerships with companies that today have GLP-1s in their portfolio, either marketed or pipeline, because we have the intellectual property on this combination, which extends to 2050. It also gives a creative path commercially for some of the GLP-1 companies to partner with us and find new applications for their GLP-1, new markets for their GLP-1 as well.
Great. So analyst coverage?
Yeah, we have 6 analysts that cover us in the U.S. I think they are BTIG, Chardin, Lake Street, H.C. Wainwright, Lucid, and Titan. So those are the 6 analysts that cover us in the U.S. I think their consensus target for us is blended probably about $18, if I'm right, somewhere between. I think the lowest is 50 and the highest is 20.
And what are you currently? Just under $5?
We're just under $5 last time I checked. So
Okay, great. So, Arun, that was terrific. Is there anything that I've missed that you'd like to discuss today?
No, I think you hit on the key points, Steve, but I think what I would like to close out and emphasize is that what we're doing is based on very strong scientific foundation. So our optimism in our outcome is not just us being blindly optimistic, but it's really grounded in solid science and the evidence to date, which is what gives us a sense of purpose that, hey, maybe we can be that company that makes a difference for these patients, and maybe we'll get there. And these patients badly need it. I sometimes get asked questions about competition. You didn't. I don't believe we have competitors in ALS, because anybody who succeeds in ALS, I wish them nothing but well. We need somebody to succeed in this space, and I think a lot of us are trying, and I'm confident that the science is advancing enough that there will be breakthroughs in ALS, and I'm hoping that Coya is one of those that delivers those for the patients.
I'm hoping as well. And so you have a very exciting next 12 to 15 months for Coya, clearly. Let's hope for your success. And obviously, your success would mean the success for ALS patients and their families. So that would be incredible. So hopefully we can do this again after your phase 2 data is released.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to come back.
Great. So this podcast is for information purposes only and should not be considered investment advice. And for additional disclosure, I'm not being compensated by Coya for making this podcast. So Arun, thank you so much. It really was a pleasure.
Thank you. A pleasure.
Okay. Take care.